Hello, and welcome to lecture number 8 for the English Renaissance, Tudor, and Elizabethan. And we're also going to be discussing neoclassical scenery during this time. This is for 1400 up to about 1700. And we're talking about England, of course, but what we're really talking about still is the growth of the Renaissance out from Italy and France that you can see in their state in this map from about 1590. And the Renaissance began in Italy, where classical Roman architecture and art and style and everything else was, but it came out of that as Italy was coming together as a country and as the church's strength and wealth was really peaking. And so we've talked a little bit about what happened in Italy and France from an architectural standpoint. And those ideas were spreading to England, obviously nearby, and they would take on a distinct character there. That's important to us because of later iterations of it that would develop, and also very important to us from a theatrical standpoint because of the way that it affected scenery and the way that we do theater in general. So we're going to be talking about those things during this lecture. Our first keyword today is the Pilister. And you may remember a similar word called the pillar. And a pillar, if you remember back to Romanesque, is just a big square column. But a pilaster is kind of a fake column. It's when you have a pillar that is intersecting the wall. So as you can see in this image, these pillars may not even really be columns at all. I mean, when you get to a certain point of architecture and you don't even need the columns because this wall is not structural, oh, but we like columns, we want to do ancient Greek stuff. Well, we'll put some fake columns, they're much easier to build, it'll be great. And so the pilasters became popular ways to have classical appearance without using classical construction methods, which were, as we remember, ultimately simplistic and just not as nice and not as complex, and did not allow for as high a quality of a standard of living, especially for interiors, but have an incredibly iconic and striking visual appearance that was greatly desired and is still greatly desired today. So here we see multiple takes on doing something classical, but not doing it the classical way. Our next keyword is marquetry. And if you remember inlay, or if you remember mosaic tiles, or if you remember zélige from the Moorish time period and culture, marquetry is kind of like that. What it is it's made out of wood, and it is extremely thin pieces of wood that are put together in a jigsaw puzzle, where what they would do is they would cut out the shape that they wanted from the table or the cabinet door. And at the same time, what they would have done is overlaid a very thin, almost paper thin sheet of a different color wood or a different type of wood. And making both of those cuts at the same time, you get the perfect size piece that you can put the other color into the first piece. And so what you see is it's not a painting, it's not tile or anything else. What it is it's all different types and different color stained wood. And so the reason this is important is, one, it's beautiful, but two, the idea that you would put that much work into something that isn't made out of stone that you know would last a really long time shows a comfort and a confidence here that tells us that they were very confident in the quality of their roofs and interiors. They didn't worry about their things getting wet. They had perfected the interior. And that is a metaphor for their society as well. They had reached a level of complexity and a time of great peace in which the struggles of life had become more political and societal than based on basic needs. So this is a room that is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York that you can go visit quite easily, but it was taken from a real room in this time period. And so every fine detail here is a different piece of wood. And so the use of perspective in this, to look into cabinets and to see something get bigger, like as the cabinet door is opening, it gets closer to us, so the edge of it is bigger. All of this is representative of the Renaissance ideas that we talked about before, but this is a specific interior architectural example. Here's some more marquetry. And this is still practiced today. It's really beautiful stuff. There are schools of it, and our artisans still practicing it today. Our next keyword is plasterwork, and kind of along the same lines. The desire for something classical, for something Roman, was very strong, and the desire to carve stone by hand was very low. And so they would make whatever types of decorative objects they wanted out of plaster. And they might have included other things, like surely these stems have wooden or some other kind of base form that they've used. But the flowers and the decorative detail is made out of plaster. Here's someone working on a plasterwork piece. And again, this also speaks to have something that's made out of plaster that could be broken at any moment. It's delicate, it's fragile. It speaks to a confidence in the peace of your society and the world around you. You don't need to build something that will stand the weather and war of thousands of years. You can build something that no one's going to touch because they're not supposed to for hundreds of years. Here's some more lovely plasterwork. You could paint it as well. On the right, we see some gold gilt work, which in the Italian Renaissance would have been referred to as ormolu for the word for gold. And this was quite elaborate and could be extensive. But throughout, we see classical shapes: leaves, egg and dart, lots of putti, and down here, leaf and dart as well. And stuff like this is still very common today. You might see it in a more minimal form, like above this chandelier, but you could see stuff like this. They make things like this still today. They make it out of plastic or vinyl and things like that you can buy for your home that are directly linked to this lineage of architectural practice. Our next keyword is brick bonds, and brick bonds are patterns in how you lay bricks. If you can imagine a brick wall, you know that the stones are overlapped. But if you want to make a really big, strong brick wall, you probably don't know that some of the bricks need to not just go left and right, but you need some of them to go up and down stage so that you can interlock them with the second row of bricks. Imagine if you have two brick walls back to back. Well, they might fall away from each other. But if you wanted to turn some of the bricks 90 degrees and run one brick across both rows, that would make it hold together really strong. And that could go on for row after row after row until the brick and concrete wall you've built could be like one solid stone of any vast size. And so ways to interlace, kind of basket weave bricks, which basket weave is one of the bonds, they were both functional in that way, but they were also stylish because it gives you a very different look. And most of these are named after a place or a country, but you can see, and I'm not going to ask you to memorize here the different brick bonds because there are many, but what I do want you to know is that they are cool. So English bond. So what we see here is a row of stretchers, which is long side of the brick, and a row of headers, which is the narrow side of the brick. And that alternates. It's a simple bond, but it'll be good for a two-row brick wall or something like that. Versus a Flemish bond, which is alternating rows of stretchers and headers. And you can easily see here how it becomes visually very striking very quickly. And there are many ways you could, so the color actually has nothing to do with it. You could do all the same color, you could do different colors, alternating colors, you could do varietal of colors, but it's just, the bond is just the pattern of bricklaying. But what it can do is it can open up kind of like latchwork or kind of like quilting. If you do color based on the pattern, then you can get some really beautiful striking work. Here is rat trap bond. So it's a type of thinner brick that's being used, and instead of being the headers being laid on the side, they're called something else and they're laid vertically. And this is a very, very striking, visually striking brick wall. And here is Flemish flared, so just a different bond. It's worth just remembering brick bonds as an idea because you can always come back and do some more research on it. And it's definitely a way that you can break up something if it's a large factory wall or something, that you could make it much more visually pleasing than just here's some bricks. This is called diapered brick. And diapered brick is any diamond pattern in brick. It can be of alternating color like this, but it doesn't have to be of alternating color, but it can be of many different colors, and you can even have colored fill, as you can see above my head here on the left. All of this leads to some really beautiful old buildings, and I would recommend that you look up some of these, but just as a reference note, in a current scenic design that I'm working on for the Texas Shakespeare Festival, I've used several of these pictures that I've shown you here as a reference for our production of Merry Wives of Windsor. Here's some more diapered brick with the diapering extruded from the wall surface. And here are just some more iterations. Here on the right again, we can see that Flemish bond house. And on the left-hand picture, of course, this is just something else. It's just another infinity of types of patterns that you could use once you know about this as an idea. Herringbone is probably a pattern that you know from fabric patterns. It could also be a brick pattern, and this is frequently a floor pattern or like a patio pattern for some reason. And another thing that I want to talk about that is not a brick bond, but it is a thing that I really love to see. It's called clinker bricks. And clinker bricks are bricks that went bad in the baking process. Just like all the way back to Mesopotamia, we were talking about adobe leading to adobe bricks. Well, bricks even today are still baked. And in baking them, if they get too hot, they might explode or break in half. And you get these messed up bricks. And I guess for a long time they threw these away. But at some point, some architect was wandering around the brickyard and said, "What are you going to do with all those bricks?" And they said, "Oh, those are clinkers. We just throw them in the pile and they go clink, and they're of no use. Nobody wants them." And somebody got a deal at some point and started doing this. But it is one of the most visually striking things that you can see, especially in a brick wall that you think is going to be a grid pattern. And once you deviate from that, it is super striking to the eye and really draws the eye and kind of makes me think about rustication. If you remember back a few lectures ago, we were talking about rustication, which is intentionally texturing stonework to draw the eye to the individual stones. This is coming out of that as an idea. And this also speaks to a future loosening of rigidity in how things get done, that we're going to see explode, crowning up to Art Nouveau and beyond. So clinker bricks, super interesting. You rarely see them, but when you do see them, definitely draws the eye. They can be not overly dramatic like this wall, or they can be, I've seen buildings built entirely out of, as we see on the right-hand picture here, like dramatic clinker bricks. That brings us up to Indigo Jones. And Indigo Jones was one of the most important neoclassical architects in England, and he was also a majorly important costume designer and set designer, and he is really worth knowing. He took several trips to France and to Italy, and he came back, and people said, "What did you bring back from France?" And he said, "Palladian architecture." And they said, "Cool." And so he built this, and he built the Queen's house as well. So this is a little chart of the different classical elements that that were used here. And you can see that Indigo Jones got big into the work of Palladio, if you remember him. And yeah, so I would have to say that I am personally not a fan of the, I would say, overly simple wall surfacing of Palladian architecture, but it is quite lovely, and it represented a major milestone in Renaissance and English architecture that still today is very, very popular. But nonetheless, it was a major thing that Indigo Jones brought back from the continent to England. And during all this time, there was tons of chunky medieval architecture in England. England, even from a fashion standpoint, for hundreds of years would just get things later than the rest of Europe, and then so it would wash up on England as sort of a fully baked new idea that would sort of smash old cultural norms, and we see that happening again and again. And so Indigo Jones's friends were like, what else did you bring back from France?" And he said, "Great parties." And they were like, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And they were like what?" And he said, "Masks." And they said, "What?" He said, "No, masks with a MASQUES. They're parties, we get dressed up, costumes, and it's theater. Theater like we've never seen before." And so Indigo Jones becomes a hugely important figure in bringing Renaissance and neoclassical theater to England. And so here are some of Indigo Jones's costume designs for masks, which are like big revels. Here's some more. They're pretty out of control. I don't know why that person's blue. Maybe that's Poseidon. I wonder what they would have painted that person blue with. So neoclassical scenery is the idea that if art in the Renaissance has perspective, where everything fades away into the background to get smaller, giving a sense of depth and realism and mathematical balance and proportion and harmony, if you remember talking about those Renaissance ideals, if the art of that period can have that, then can the theater have that? And so it led to neoclassical scenery, which for England was a lot more scenery than they had had in the past. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But you can see here that they needed to create the proscenium, which is, of course, this arch that is around the stage, because that served as a picture frame for the perspective scenery shrinking away into the distance. So they were creating this balanced, harmonious, perspective-based art in 3 dimensions using 2-dimensional scenery in layers, which we'll see in a second. So a brief history of scenic design is that we talked a little bit about classical, like actual Greek and Roman scenery, which was somewhat minimal. By the medieval period, the church had largely taken over all storytelling, and there were 2 main types of theater scenery. One that you see on the right in this long sort of hallway. These were called mansions. And what that was is it might be a morality play where you could walk along and each little scene of the morality play, let's say it's a guy's life, and in the beginning he's very well off. And then you would walk along and you would see the next scene. Maybe this is at a fair or something. You see the next scene where he is tempted by something. And so you would walk along and you would watch the next scene. And each scene would play out in front of a different little mansion that would represent the location of where it was supposed to be. Maybe it's his parents' home, his work, or something. And then by the end, he makes a terrible mistake and he's dragged down into the hellmouth that you see on the far right. And so these medieval morality plays would be played out in a sequence like that. And you could walk along and get each scene as you went. So there wasn't a stage where the scene took place and scenery would come along. They would move the audience. And they got tired of doing that. And then they would do this thing that is here on the left side of the image. And what that is a wagon. And so it's exactly the same, but totally the opposite, where the audience would stay in a place or they would just be in a village square or whatever. And the play would come through on a series of wagons, and each scene would be played out, one scene after another, and you could watch it or not. And kind of like the same thing. But both of these really defy our contemporary idea of the stage, totally. So by the Elizabethan period, we're here with Shakespeare in the Globe, and this is what we think about when we think Shakespeare, and this is what we think about for early Renaissance and medieval English theater. But this is exactly like, for the most part, classical Roman theater. We have a scene in the back that is just creating a wall with entrances and an upper level that the actors can use as well. There are pillars down front that are useful for hiding behind and running around, but what there isn't is a lot of scenery that represents specific locations or even specific props for locations or the events of the play. It's more about just the acting and the storytelling. And the crowd sort of gathers around in a big semicircle, just like Roman theater. And so English theater of this time was a lot more like Roman theater that you think of as classical. Neoclassical theater, coming out of Renaissance Italy, sought to make a new type of theater based on the ideals that the Renaissance scholars and artists had assigned to classical art and the classical societies, even beyond what was really true about those societies. And neoclassical theater would take theater farther away from classical practice in theater. We're going to talk all about that in just a second, but I want to show you a video first. So here is a video of a neoclassical scene change. There are still 3 theaters in the world that are left from this time period, amazingly. And you can go to them and see a production in this manner. The Drottningholm Theater in Sweden, the Český Krumlov Castle Theater in the Czech Republic, and the Versailles Palace Theater in France. And what's remarkable here is that what they have done is they figured out how to use their architectural practice, especially the machinery that they were using to haul these giant stones way up in the air. They thought, we'll turn those on the side, and then instead of moving things up and down, we'll be able to move things left and right. And so for the first time ever, in order to achieve their goals of perspective scenery and to represent each scene location, they were able to make scenery that would slide in and out. And they would stack these pieces one behind the other, and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 behind the other. And when the scene change would come, the one that was on would slide off, and the one that they wanted next would slide on. And you can imagine elaborate systems of ropes and pulleys underneath the stage and a bunch of huge dudes just turning this giant winch to get all of this to move. And we're going to watch this, I think, at least twice, but let's look at this and see what happens. And so in our mind, this doesn't seem like it's that complicated or nice. This is certainly not the level of automation that you would see on Broadway. But to imagine that this was done with nothing but wood and ropes and no electricity at all, and that it's all timed out perfectly. These drops roll in and unfurl. These pieces slide on the sides. And there are many other types of machinery. And so if you were sitting right in the middle of all this, at the center of the audience, you would see from your perspective a perfect view of everything changing. And it does it very quickly. And so that seat came to be called the ducal throne, where there's one seat where the perspective right in the middle on the proscenium was perfect. Another thing that was part of this is raked stages. So in order to get the perspective right, they wanted everything to shrink into the distance. And part of that was having the stage be on a sloped angle so that at the back of the stage, everything would be up and further away. And that's where we get the term upstage from, is when stages would be raked. If you went further away from the audience, you'd be climbing up a hill a little bit. You'd be walking up the stage. And that's where upstage comes from. This next video shows a few additional neoclassical elements that I think are really worth noting. You can see on the left and the right here that over on stage right, our left, there is a forest scene of various slices of pieces upstage, and we might anticipate that those might slide out at some point. And over on stage left, our right, you can see the same thing. What's interesting is that in this particular scene, they're not the same, which is unusual. You can also see an interesting piece of scenery down here in the center stage, which is like the painting of a rock on some sort of a box, and they could move that around because there would be a slot in the floor. In fact, in the Czech Republic, this style of theater is called Slotstheater because each of these pieces would have a slot in the ground where the piece coming down from the scenery would be like a knife sticking down into the slot, and the rope or whatever would grab that and slide it along the slot. So what we also see, though, are these waves and this ship in the background, and that's worth looking at while we watch this video. Okay, so let's move on. I think that's as interesting as the scenery gets in this particular video. But this is where the idea of seeing what we're talking about comes from in the theater. Not to just walk in and say the words, but to have more and more all the time to bring the story into a world of its own, taking place within the sphere of influence of the theater's, the venue. So what exactly they're doing back there, it looks like that those waves are made out of cylinders of fabric and that something inside them is turning as this flat ship is moving along on a slot. Very interesting. I think it's worth just looking at a few seconds of this last video because of one particular stage machine that is being used here. And I'll just turn it on and talk over it. If you look at this, if you look at this water fountain, what it is a cylinder of fabric that is spinning continuously, and whether someone is behind it just kind of moving it along or whether it's tied to some under the stage pulley system, it is super interesting because it would take a lot of work in the 15th or 16th centuries to make the wheels and tubes that this is turning on, all by hand, everything carved by hand, all the ropes hand stretched and wove together. So it represents innovation, and also that there were people who had enough time and enough money to pay for this to be done. I want to go back for a second and talk about the invention of this, which we didn't talk about during the Renaissance video last week. But all of this was developed, and some of it was invented by Giacomo Torelli, who was referred to in his time in Italy as the Great Wizard. And especially the chariot and pole system, where each piece of scenery would have a slot piece going down into the stage that could be moved back and forth. Chariot and pole scenery was extremely influential throughout the next few centuries, and Giacomo Torelli helped develop and perfect that. To, if you read about it, to the rage of some of his competitors. But you could design basically anything. You could have forests, you could have columns, you could have rooms that looked very much like what the interiors of these these neoclassical Renaissance interiors would look like. And you could quickly change from scene to scene throughout a play almost as quickly as the actors could go off and come back on with a different prop. And so Indigo Jones saw this in France. And as an architect and a practitioner of the stage, he was amazed by it. And he went on to design some very elaborate neoclassical scenic stage designs. And he built some theaters along these new practices and was responsible for bringing it to England. So we're going to see a series of these practices. And what's notable about it is that even though they had gotten to the point where they were like, oh, we should have something for every scene, we should have a location, we can change it out. Because the Renaissance ideals of balance and symmetry were in full swing at this point, you can see that they all sort of have bilateral symmetry. They all sort of have these receding layers that are quite clear. You can see where the pieces are going to go out and become something else. You can see also that in their renderings they were cheating because it looks like you're really there, but on the stage, of course, this would have to be broken down into perspective pieces that shrunk into the distance. This looks like it's an engraving of an actual place. You can see this is by Giacomo Torelli down here on the right. And so they got quite carried away with what they were capable of doing, which is wonderful. They did, in fact, have things that would descend from the fly loft, including like giant cloud pieces with people on them. So the idea of this guy on this horse, they probably really did that. And if you look at some of the videos of this on YouTube, you can see people coming down in the cloud things. It's very, very interesting. And so here's a rendering of that. And Indigo Jones would go on to continue to do this for the rest of his life. And here are some of his color renderings or paintings that would represent some, at least ideas about what would be on the stage. Now we're going to move on to the Tudor Of course, Tudor was sort of a dynasty, a royal family in England, but it also was a style of architecture that became popular during their time. Of course, medieval stone and brickwork, and this style of thing was done before the Tudors as well, but it kind of bloomed during this period. And what Tudor architecture is mainly about is this half timbering. And half timbering is that the outer structure and the inner structure would be made out of these beams instead of stone, instead of brick, to have these beams and to fill in the space between them with something that's called wattle and daub. And what that would be is it's exactly the same thing as adobe. It's you would have a bunch of sticks or whatever random stuff you had to fill in all the gaps, and then you would cover it over with clay and mud, and that would bake in the sun and dry out. And so we see some very old techniques being brought forth into the usage of being able to use along with masterful woodwork and carpentry. But we've seen a lot of this timber work as well. If you remember all the way back to our Asian lecture, throughout all of these civilizations, we're seeing something similar. But it took on a particular characteristic in Tudor England because of the visual boldness of it, especially using when it's used in black and white color. And the repeating geometric pattern of it is also very distinctive. And so when you see buildings that look like this, these are Tudor characteristics. It got very, very elaborate, quite geometric and decorative, far beyond what would be necessary to hold up the structure. You could see half timbering work that became solely for purposes of decor. And you could also see it in interiors as well, because the interior walls would be framed up in the same manner, whether they needed that much strength or not, and it became a desirable visual element at various levels of complexity. And we're going to see some of these shapes and colors and Tudor elements in our production of Wind in the Willows in the spring. The next keyword is brickwork chimneys. And we're talking about chimneys, but elaborate brickwork was something that could be seen on walls and anywhere else as well, but particular in these Tudor chimneys, elaborate patterns and structures in brick construction. There are many, many different types, and what it really represents is a loosening of expression, of characteristics. Much like the Byzantines felt confident enough in their architectural practice to improvise on what the Romans had been doing, so too did Tudor brick masons and architects feel that they could improvise. So you see there would be many of these near each other that were entirely different. So this is quite relaxed and quite full of expression for the English people at this time. And there were many different types, of course. And they're super interesting, really lovely. And this was not necessary in any way to get the smoke out of your house, right? It became something that was purely formal. And there were some of these would also be made out of terracotta. So you'll see smaller ones that are maybe a little bit less elaborate. You might see them on top of. Actually, you can see it in this one. This picture on the right, there's a small terracotta chimney pot on top of that chimney. And here's some more Tudor-style terracotta pots. These types of chimneys you might think of as like from Mary Poppins, and certainly this kind of practice continued in England through up until the time period where Mary Poppins takes place in 1910. That brings us to our next keyword, jettying. Jettying is simply when a building gets larger in its footprint on higher floors. It could be just the second floor is bigger, or it could be tiered outward. And think all the way back to our first lecture, to the ziggurats, the cake tier pyramids of Mesopotamia. This is like exactly the opposite of that. And it is bold and daring, and to do this shows an incredible confidence in what you're doing. And the reason for doing it is to get more floor space as you go up in the building without taking up sidewalk space, because people were living more and more close together. There weren't always just people living out in the country. More and more people were living in the cities. And so jettying became a practice that allowed you to have good sidewalk space and then more floor space as you went up. And it is very common, almost ubiquitous in Tudor architectural practice. Here's some more jettying. You don't get that much floor space out of it, and for the architectural difficulty, I'm not sure it was worth it. It's certainly little done today, and little done outside of Tudor architecture, but very common. Even just to do it a little, I think it must have been a stylistic choice. Our next keyword is diamond-leaded windows, and these windows, as we remember all the way back to mullion and Munton windows, these windows represent a much more delicate window. Much like the stained glass of Gothic cathedrals, they're individual panes of glass, and what's between them is strips of lead. And the lead, if you were to look at the strip of lead on end, it would look like an H, because each pane of glass kind of slots into the lead glazing bar. And why they're diamond, I don't know. It became kind of like the black and white thing. It just became, that's the thing. But diamond pattern windows are extremely common in all of Tudor architecture, as well as a few other interesting diamond glass patterns as well. You can see some very interesting decorative half timbering here on this structure as well. And so half timbering and all of this can range from kind of countryside looking, as these faded beams do with this diamond-leaded window panes, or it can be quite formal as the harsh black and white structures we saw earlier. Here's some more diamond-leaded window panes with some horizontal bars of support, because all of this is very, very delicate glass, but of course lead is one of the softest metals. And so for the Elizabethan time period, a little bit later, all of this blocky and functional medieval architecture gave way to elaborate manor houses. They would actually compete for Queen Elizabeth's attention because she frequently toured the country and she would critique the accommodations provided to her by the nobility. I don't know if she did this for the purposes of raising the whole country up in architecture, but because they had reached a time where a lot of war had happened and they had sort of gotten to a peace where they didn't need to build walls around everything, they didn't need to live in a castle, the wealthy began to build mansions, really, really lovely, nice homes with incredibly elegant and gorgeous interiors that gave them a very high quality of living that were very poor defensive structures. You can see the amount of windows in this house, for instance. These people are not anticipating an attack of any kind. These manor houses just became mansions that were the entire nobility competing to show off their wealth and their standard of living, bringing a lot of Palladian and other Renaissance architectural shapes over from Italy and France, but also just making a bunch of rectangles, as you can see here. Hardwick Hall is one of the most famous manor houses, which these are also called prodigy houses because they were thought to be each one a little gem. And they used to say about Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall. And it speaks to that idea that they were starting to feel so safe that they could build the whole house out of glass if they were capable of it, and they did as much as they could. Here's another picture of Hardwick Hall. And here are just a few more pictures of some of these manor houses that I think are quite remarkable. We're getting into the time when the houses were built that get referenced in things like Downton Abbey and other things about English gentry of that time period. All of this English society and its wealth and complexity was being built up during this time. And drawing from Renaissance architecture and replacing their medieval stuff with this is how that all sort of took the shape that it had. Here's another manor house. you can see a lot of these become quite fantastical. They do not adhere strictly to Renaissance architectural practice. They seem to be kind of informed by it, but then there's a lot of freedom also to do what they want. There's a lot of rectangular windows, which generally were not done at all. And that speaks to the distance of England from the continent. Even though the English Channel at its thinnest is only 3 miles across, there was a cultural and linguistic difference and separation that gave them a certain improvisational freedom. Our last keyword is festoon, and a festoon is usually carved from wood or stone. It's a relief of a hanging wreath or hanging floral work. It is decorative. It is purely ornamental. It was found in the classical time period. It was found in Rome, but it was incredibly popular during this time period. During this time period, their interest in classical stuff changed from being about the structural elements like columns and things to a confidence that they knew how to build stuff. So let's just take the decorative stuff, the cool stuff. So festooning is one of the coolest things that for sure they could take, one of the most purely decorative things that they could do. And this is ubiquitous in neoclassical architecture. Here's actually an ancient Roman example. You could see both oak leaves and flowers and fruit and food and seashells and all kinds of crazy stuff would be in these festoons. And these are also called swags sometimes. Here's one almost entirely of oak leaves, which is very lovely. And so these are our keywords for English, Renaissance, Tudor, Elizabethan, and neoclassical scenery. It's a lot to get through, and there's a lot more to talk about in this, but with the limited amount of time we have, these are the main concepts, and I hope that you will do some of your own research on this as well. So our words are Pilister, marquetry, plasterwork, brick bonds, Indigo Jones, neoclassical scenery. Under Tudor, we have half timbering, brickwork chimneys, jettying, diamond-leaded windows, Elizabethan manor houses, and festoon. And so I'll be writing you an email soon to be talking about the assignments that we have going on this week and next. And if you have any questions, of course, as always, please contact me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.